Property development simplified. And today, Elliot and VJ are going to talk a little bit about LandTech, some of their products. VJ's an engineering manager of one of the data teams, and we're going to talk about some of the complexity of millions of unstructured data sets and what some of the teams are actually doing with that data and how they're doing things. So stay with us for the duration of this. I think we've got quite a cool one coming up. VJ, how's things? How are you?
Yeah, I'm really well, thank you. Just trying to get myself through the heat of today.
Yeah, I know it's tough, isn't it? We're what, coming to the end of June, so yeah, it is pretty nuts out there, or it has been pretty nuts out there.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things. I struggle with heat, so trying to make my way through it is a daily challenge in the summer.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy. Tell us a little bit about your role at LandTech and I guess the start of your journey at LandTech and what that looked like.
Yeah, okay. So I joined LandTech about a year and a half ago. I joined as a senior engineer, and I suppose my focus recently in my career has been more, I suppose, back end in the data space.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I suppose I started out in back end in my career, and then I moved and worked in various other places, front end and mobile. But then kind of really decided I like working in data. Um, I suppose at LandTech, my journey has been. I started off as an individual contributor, as a senior. Got to learn a lot about our existing data sets in the UK.
Yeah.
And I joined before we sort of started expanding out to um, international. And I suppose it gave me a good grounding of land data, property data sets, how they work in the UK, but also those kind of like those principles and patterns for how we expect and think land data will work, globally. So I took on the lead role for a couple of reasons. Um, I enjoy a combination of being technical but also managerial. So, a large part of the enjoyment in my work is helping teams grow, helping individuals grow in their career path, but also helping teams with things like architecture and defining strategy as a team and giving clarity and direction. So that's been really enjoyable. I get to balance both aspects in my role.
I kind of feel like I'm going to go 2 feet into this one without meaning to, but you spoke there about principles and patterns of land data and what that looks like globally. And you've obviously caught my attention offline 5-10 minutes ago where we're talking about international expansion and the complexity with the UK land data might differ somewhere else. Are there principles and patterns that are pretty consistent throughout globally, and how might that change as well?
Yeah, this one's a tricky one. I think that when you're working with specific data, of course, it varies depending on the region that you're in. Language varies, terminology varies.
True.
So trying to find or even create the one way that works for everyone is difficult and unlikely to succeed. It's like trying to force everyone to learn, a specific language globally.
Yeah.
It's not something that's gonna work successfully. But I think there's a degree of flexibility in how we, I suppose, model data that
Okay.
allows us to, I suppose, respond to that level of diversity in the data sets. So yeah, I can go more into that, and how what that looks like and how we're sort of approaching those problems.
Yeah.
If you want me to.
We've got some parts on that later. I did think I'd go 2 feet, so I'll take 1 foot back out. Help us understand a little bit about LandTech and a couple of the products within LandTech so that we can understand the business and what you guys and girls do on a daily basis?
Yeah, sure. So, I suppose, a bit of background on LandTech. It was formed by two co-founders, Andrew Moist, who was a software developer, and Johnny Britton, a former town planner. And they were, sort of, I suppose they kind of met on Twitter and wanted to solve this problem of like land data and property data, and making it
Yep.
useful to develop on land. I think as a company we're very large. We're one of the largest PropTechs in the UK,
Okay.
and I think our products, LandInsight, LandEnhance, and LandFund, really, I suppose, demonstrate and kind of have given us the grounding in the UK. LandInsight's our flagship, so suppose it's really about helping land developers
Yep.
to source sites and assess those sites, and it's really about driving insights through data, and
Yep.
and having tools in the product that really allow our customers to utilize that data in their decision making.
Yep.
So there's a lot of centralization of various data. Who owns land, what the local authority's policy is around around those areas of land.
Got you.
Or yeah, and so utilizing that data plus the end-to-end workflow for a site being an area of developable land.
Yep.
Effectively it gives a journey for our land developers. Gives them that kind of single tool to manage that whole process. And LandEnhance is more, it's kind of an additional product that's very much around simplifying planning application approval. And so, it does this by bringing lots of planning data, historic, current, across the UK into one place, making it very searchable. And yeah, ultimately it helps customers to find information that will help them in getting their own planning applications approved.
Got you.
Yeah.
Thinking about your team, and we're going to touch on some of the engineering challenges in a second, is your team driven towards all three of those products? You building something that, I guess, supplements those three products, or are you isolated in a product vertical that supports one of those?
Yeah, good question. So we don't in the data team align specifically to products. It's so I suppose the way we structure our teams around data is, currently we structure around data domains, so there'll be related data sets that kind of group together, and we would
Yeah.
have data teams that own the knowledge around that data. We are trying to move away from that, and I will actually get into that when we talk about the platform. The
Yeah.
idea being that if we have to have an engineering team know
Yeah.
about data sets, then actually when we scale that to thousands,
Yeah.
it starts becoming hard to scale. And so we want to be able to, we actually as engineers want to be able to move away from that model of knowing about planning applications or knowing about policy data.
Got you.
Instead, work on that platform that enables others to, I suppose, non-technical people to keep that data set domain knowledge in their heads.
Got you.
Yeah.
What are some of the engineering challenges that come for some of your engineers actually trying to structure that data then?
Our ultimate goal here is we want to be able to scale data sets. And so naturally there's going to be trade-offs when we want to do something like that. And I think when we think about data, we have to think about it in terms of abstractions. And so I think it's a mistake for us to say, let's take each data set in its own right and model data around that specific data set.
Mhm.
I think that doesn't scale well. It means you have to do that process for every data set. And
Yep.
so, for us, it's about thinking, the challenge is thinking about a particular set. I suppose it's about looking at, it's like, I suppose the challenge is looking holistically at all of our
Okay.
data and saying, how do we take this data and create a model that can capture this data flexibly? Um, and that's a challenge because I think historically, and I suppose engineers may perhaps naturally do this. It's to get into the domain and start thinking
Yeah.
about how do you match your code, how do you match
Okay.
data models to
Okay.
this specific domain. So for example, if I've got planning applications, how do I model planning applications in a data model? How do I
Okay.
create APIs around planning applications? Um, Now, it's not to say that we wouldn't do that. There are definitely cases where we need really specific modeling on our data sets. But,
Yeah.
but it's not a sensible default because it doesn't allow us to scale. It means
Yeah.
that we can't reuse that model. Whereas if we think more abstractly, it allows us to say, let's model things more abstractly. For example, if we model things as land or
Yeah.
areas of land with associated data against it,
Yeah.
that's better than saying, oh well, it's a property that has a planning application against it. And so
Yeah.
that level of abstraction allows us to capture any kinds of data against that area of land. And so that's how we want to think about things by default.
Yeah.
But also not force things into that approach where it really doesn't work for us.
Got you. I can see the group now. You've explained it. The grouping or the formatting of the data is really quite key.
Yeah, I mean, the the data model, I think, is one of the central parts to making all of this scalable. I think the fewer data models you have, and you can the fewer you have, and the more you can reuse them to capture hundreds, thousands of data sets,
Yeah.
the less work there is to do to get those data sets in. In a world where you have a generic model that can handle multiple data sets, you're
Yeah.
really there's inherent complexity in the data that you receive.
Yeah.
Someone's going to give you some data. You've got to be able to say, I've got my data on the left and I've got my model on the right, and I've got to map the data across. I think that's going to be there. There's inherent complexity. We can't get past that. But it makes it a lot easier if you can focus on that mapping without having to worry about creating a new model each time, or even APIs over that data. Every time we add a data set, if we have to engineer a new data API for that data set, it creates a lot of engineering effort. Um, so yeah, that model enables all of this. If you have that data model that can capture multiple data sets, um, you can reuse that model. You can have a single API over that model
Yeah.
that can present and make available lots of different kinds of data sets.
Is this a way of working or a model that you've introduced recently? Once you've learned a little bit more about the complexity of the data, is it something that you've spotted as a team and thought, actually, we almost need to kind of re-engineer this because this is actually how the data is going to scale? It can't scale if we're so finite with some of our data models.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the answer to that is we have evolved to it. Um,
Right.
I think that we're pretty, I suppose, relatively, we are quite young as a company, and a lot of our hires are reasonably new, and so we're all learning a lot about land data and how it works. I think we were recently challenged to incorporate a UK data set that had some commercial priority, and I think that actually challenged us to think a little bit more and think about how we reuse some of the systems we have, or not necessarily reuse, but repurpose or refactor some of the systems we have. And that's the approach we took actually. So
Yeah.
we had an existing data set. We looked at the data model and said, you know what? If we just change some of the terminology around our data model, make it
Yeah.
a little bit more abstract so that it's less coupled to a specific data set, we start forming this sort of picture of an abstraction. And we did that with what we had. So we effectively refactored what we had. We incorporated a new data set into that model. and it's serving as a foundation now for international data sets as well. We're on a journey with this because we're still learning the limits of that decision,
Okay.
and so it's really important to us that we continue to look at all data sets that we have or that could be coming up,
Yeah.
and look at our model and say, is it going to work? How do we have to adapt and evolve that model to incorporate the data? But we also have to be willing to say, we have certain data sets that come in that just don't fit this model, and
Yeah.
and to avoid complexity, unnecessary risk, we just have that separate, and
Do you? Okay.
we develop separately for that. Yeah.
Nice. I think you covered off some of the limits there quite well. That was going to be my next question, is in what is some of the limitations of working that way? Your last point actually was probably the thought that came to my mind.
Yeah, I think some of the limitations are that ultimately when you model data into one model, the model in general, certainly the associated data against pieces of land, they're relatively simple. Like, it really is just, there's a key and then there's a value. Um, the moment you have sort of more complex data, where perhaps there's really complex relationships between certain bits of data, um, trying to model that into a key value store doesn't work so easily.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to say there's hard limits to the model, and perhaps the complexity of this data, the relationships that are needed between certain bits of data, are just a step too far for trying to push it into this model. And so we have to look at the edges, the boundaries of
Yeah.
that approach. I suppose the important thing is that something like this could serve as a sensible default, that we can unlock value from data sooner by using this simpler approach. But then we can evolve and iterate if we find that the problem warrants its own data model, warrants its
Yeah.
own feature um, in its entirety in our products. We can we can specialize around those areas, rather than, I suppose, using that approach up front for everything.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, hope that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. You've come up with quite a nice solution as well. Like I think meshing the two bits together around the scale of the data, I think this will play quite nicely with it. But you've come up with a solution. We wanted to talk about the platform team that you've built, and the idea around the platform team was really to, I think, speed up the processing of some of the data coming into your platform. And I do want to talk on the other side of that, as in the scale of that data when you do go global and some of those expected challenges. But talk to us a little bit about the platform team, the idea of the platform team, and what you do and why.
Yeah, sure. So the data engineering team actually consists of a couple of sub teams, and I suppose we're going through the journey, as I mentioned earlier, where historically we've been owners of UK data sets. We've held all that knowledge in our head, and so we've been sort of data teams, but we're trying to move to this data platform team. And so our goals change from knowing about specific data sets, UK or global data sets, more into creating a reusable platform that people like data analysts or even non-technical people can utilize, so that they're empowered to incorporate data sets themselves. And so I suppose how we've structured this is very much in flux, but our current focus is around how we source data into our platform,
Yeah.
because we have lots of different data formats, CSVs, more geospatial formats like shapefiles, um, and putting those into our system so that we can start making use of them requires us to have a reasonably flexible platform component that will very easily be configured for new data sets. And so that's kind of one piece. It's what are those sort of connectors that
Yep.
we need to create so that we can fetch data from lots of places. And so, and it's more complex than just a file. We have data that's on websites, might need scraping. We might have FTP integrations. We might
Yep.
have to get some data from APIs. It could vary, it could grow. I suppose the important thing is that, we're thinking about those connectors as platform pieces that can be reused rather than, say, writing a connector for each data set.
Got you.
So we have a team around that, and they're very focused around that problem.
Yep.
And then we have a team who's focused more around the transform of data. So we've got some data's landed in our data lake, and we need to do the work of the left to right mapping. So something's come in and it's got a bunch of fields, and I've got my data model on the right, and
Yep.
I need to map the left to the right, and perhaps do other things in the middle. We might derive some new data. We might do some data quality testing.
Yep.
But that team is really responsible for defining the transform platform components. So that's an interesting piece. It's about thinking about what those abstractions are around transforms. So we could sit there and we could write custom transforms in SQL.
Yep.
We could do that for every data set. But what we really need to be doing as a platform team is saying, well, what are the patterns for transforms? What usually happens? It's usually, at a basic level, it really is, I've got a field on the left and I need to map it to a particularly named field in my model. That's a very simple pattern. It doesn't require anything dataset specific, but bar the actual configuration of what the field on the left is and what the field on the right is. But it doesn't require necessarily engineering effort. It
Yep.
requires someone to know what that data means and define those mappings.
Got you.
So that's one aspect, but there can be other things as well. We might enrich the data. So, for example, we might get some land data, and we might want to call a service that will give us the address for that data. And so we might have a component that will, abstract that. So, we would create a service that could take in some coordinates or some location and return back an address. Again, very reusable. Doesn't depend on a particular data set. So yeah, I suppose the job there is to identify what those abstractions are, and that's an incremental process. We do a couple of data sets. We realize, oh look, there's clearly an abstraction here. Let's create a library that can, or a service that could, encapsulate the abstraction so that we can start using it on multiple data sets. So,
I was going to say, how are you going to configure some of these global data sets that you're going to be gathering now that you're going global? How are you actually going to configure that? But I think it sounds as if you've kind of nailed that with centralizing some of the data, using libraries, with what you're talking about.
yeah, I mean, the configuration of this, there's a kind of a pathway, I suppose, that we're thinking really. So, it sort of starts with that reuse and making abstractions and libraries that I suppose reduce the level of code needed to be the simplest form. And then I think our natural progression is to configure in code. We just separate out the things that are more library specific from
Yeah.
the things that are just configuration for a specific data set. That's useful because it means that as engineers, because that configuration is close to code and still in our world, we can really
Yeah.
drive out those abstractions and prove that they work before we start handing out that configuration beyond beyond the engineering team. So the next progression, really, beyond doing things in code, is trying to get data analysts to take on
Got you.
that kind of configuration. And so, we might make things configurable through configuration files that can be, that can just be checked into source control. Again, it doesn't requires a degree of technical knowledge around SQL, maybe a bit of Git knowledge, but it doesn't require deep engineering skills. So,
Got you.
then we can progress beyond that, right? We can think about how that configuration can be driven from UIs, perhaps. But ultimately, what we've done is we've set the base for a configuration API, and how that configuration is driven, whether it's through some files or whether through a UI, we can evolve to that by building on the foundations that we create at each stage. So yeah, that's the approach we're taking. We don't want to jump into go and make all of this configurable in a
Fine.
UI. We have to be able to learn, and that's
Yeah.
the value we'll provide as engineers to learn how best to structure these abstractions. And then we have to be able to really, I suppose, we have to be able to unlock value sooner.
Yeah.
If we're trying to build a fancy configuration UI, when we could just be having some configuration through a text file, it's a lot cheaper to start there, learn
Yeah.
through that mechanism, and then evolve to more complex ways of configuring our processing.
That makes sense. Can you give us a little bit of an indication as to the platform technologies and the makeup of what you've built? It'd be really good to try and understand that, but also, the why you've used certain technologies and how you've used them.
Yeah, there's quite a lot to go through here, but I'll start somewhere. So I suppose our central store of data is our data warehouse, which we've used Redshift for. The reasons for having that central warehouse are actually beyond just the need for scaling data sets. We want to be able to have that Redshift data warehouse for lots of analytical reasons as well. And so it's a very strategic piece. The reason we picked Redshift is that Redshift is the closest data warehousing technology
Yeah.
to Postgres, and Postgres has really high maturity for storing geospatial data. And so it was, there's lots of factors obviously to Redshift, but that's a key one. It supports geospatial data. It has high maturity in supporting geospatial data, and that's a big part of what we do with our data.
Yeah.
There's lots of things as well, like it's far more approachable for a team that has already been using Postgres, and so yeah, Redshift has been a recent addition, but it's been sort of easier to adopt and accommodate because it's closer to Postgres, which is where we started. So that's the data store. I think in terms of how we define our transforms, we use DBT. DBT is effectively it's kind of, I suppose the way I like to see it is it's an extension on SQL. It allows you to organize SQL around the data, but it also allows you to do a lot of reuse, and it sort of allows you to create those sort of frameworks and libraries so that you can almost reuse snippets of SQL in
Nice.
various places, which is key for us because we have to be able to say, much like you could do in ordinary code like Python, we'd have to be able to say we notice an abstraction in our SQL processing that we could apply to lots of data sets. Let's put that in a library or a package that we can reuse in lots of SQL code.
Yeah.
So it's a very key enabler in the platform. It's also really, like, I think it's a tool that's used by a lot of data analysts. So from a hiring perspective, we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm
Yeah.
around a tool like DBT, and so
Good.
it's very
Just
much
had a quick look. Looks cool.
very much in line with kind of sharing that skill set around data analysis. We use Python as our language of choice in the data side. The apps teams use TypeScript,
Makes
but
sense.
for us, it's very much Python focused because, well, the data world is Python. There's lots of support.
Yeah.
There's lots of frameworks that that are built in Python. Yeah, so I've covered language, database, SQL. We use a tool called Prefect for our batch orchestration pipelines. I don't know if you know much about Prefect, but Prefect is similar to a tool called Airflow. It's just a directed graph of processing steps for data. We're not coupled to some of these choices. We realize that when and if our use cases increase in complexity, we might not want to have a single batch orchestration pipeline. We might actually want to go to a more kind of event-driven architecture.
Nice.
So, for example, if like one of our processing pipelines is so complex that it requires 3 teams to work on, we
Yeah.
may not have a pipeline that all 3 teams work on. We might just have events that are triggered to various
Got you.
teams who then continue their stage of the processing. So yeah, we have a vision around how that processing can evolve.
Smart.
But Prefect is really simple at this point. Like, it adds a lot of value for us right now. It gives you a visual single location to check some data processing, its progress, where things have failed. It centralizes logging and monitoring around
Yeah.
all of that stuff. So it's a really nice place to start, and it's provided a lot of value for us in that regard.
Love it.
Yeah, and I think around the edges, a lot of our infrastructure is AWS.
Yeah.
It's I suppose there's lots of choices there, but historically we started on AWS, and it has lots of mature services. S3 for data laking, Redshift, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
So that's kind of something we're sticking with and not trying to move away from.
Love it.
Yeah.
Good. Do you think you're ready for the global tackle?
I think the global tackle is going to be a journey for sure. I think it's challenging us to think about how we make things easier.
Yeah.
But also we are far away from it. We are trying to push out to new countries right now. We have roadmaps for getting out to new countries in the next few months, and so we have to be able to make sensible trade-offs in the areas of the platform
Yeah.
that we do alongside that process. There'll be things that won't be perfect, in terms of platform before
Yeah.
we have to reach those commercial goals. But equally, there'll be areas and small wins that we can move towards as part of that work. And I think it's important because I think it's starting to get us all to realize the need for making this a bit easier.
Yeah.
But I can't lie and say that this is going to be easy. There's a
Yeah.
long journey there. There's lots of learnings. There's probably some mistakes we'll made that we'll have to correct and iterate on. But I think that's okay, because I think the general direction is correct. The key thing is that we spot those really like high value, low effort things that
Yeah.
work for our current context. So
Yeah.
like we're seeing some obvious things. Well, actually, the generic data model things have come about through our international expansion. It's being applied to a certain group of data sets already.
Nice.
But and I think, and then there's more than that. We're starting to realize that for us, so for my team, we're trying to roll out to these new regions,
Yeah.
and we're starting to realize there could be hundreds of these regions already in the next couple of months, and so we're starting to challenge ourselves and say, well, do we want to be sitting there and writing these things for
Yeah.
each city, or
Yeah.
do we actually want to be setting in some framework, even if it's minimal,
Makes sense.
just to make that process a bit easier when we get to it? And so, yeah, that's what it's about. It's about saying where are we? What's going to challenge us soon, and what are the simple things that we could do now that's going to make that a bit easier. And we just keep
Love it.
continually doing that, and then the platform evolves and matures over time.
Love it. Love it. Good. Well, tell us a little bit about your teams and how you set them up for success. Lastly, I'd be quite keen to know that.
Yeah. So okay. So I suppose I can talk from an engineering perspective. So we have a divide in the engineering between apps and data. Um, the reason for that, hopefully, I kind of hinted on it earlier. Both sides of that, I suppose, that divide are trying to do their own platforming. So I've talked a lot about data platforming, but there is an app side platform as well. And so by having those centralized teams, it essentially allows a community of teams or people to work around that problem together. Um, However, it's not that simple, of course, because we're in this position where we're still building a platform. There's a lot of knowledge that needs to reside in the engineering teams around data
Yeah.
sets, and so we have to be able to cross collaborate, not just with other data teams who are in the same department, but also with app teams who are working on the same data sets. So we're in this sort of murky world right now where we have to work with apps teams and data teams,
Yeah.
but we manage that and we align together to kind of get things done on the platform side, but also on the data product delivery side. Um, I suppose in terms of structure, I think um, our data teams consist mostly of data engineers with a data product manager.
Okay.
We have data analysts who work very closely with us, who are very much the experts on the data sets. They're involved in the data journey right from the beginning,
Yep.
understanding understanding if data quality is up to scratch, whether we can actually make use of that data.
Got you.
As a data team, we don't have a designer, we don't have UI products that we
Yeah.
build, but on the app side, we do have similar structured teams with software engineers, product managers, but also UX and design roles as well. Yeah, I think in terms of like our general culture, we have a good degree of autonomy in teams. So teams are allowed to decide their own process, um, define what works for them. Um, Obviously, we have sort of, I suppose, bigger engineering ways of doing things. We want teams to be delivering,
Yeah.
continuously, iteratively. So that applies to any team. But in terms of the specific processes of that team, it's really up for them to decide how they want to do it. Um, there are some limits, of course. We we don't want sort of tech proliferation.
Yeah.
Um, so it's important that we align more globally across the engineering teams on the tech choices, and ensuring that if we are proposing changes in tech, that we get really wide alignment and consensus on those kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Good.
So
Good.
certain things happen, more globally. Certain things teams are free and autonomous to decide themselves.
Yeah. I think a nice balance between the two sets you in good stead, especially nowadays. I think as well. People do want autonomy around what's going to directly impact them on a day-to-day basis. You need that.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Um, yeah, I think culturally the teams are we're, regardless of the engineering team, we're really focused on regular delivery, CI/CD, automating that
Nice.
whole process. Um, Collaboration is huge. I touched on it. We work with other data teams. We work with apps teams. We work with a variety of roles, and no one sort of isolate from that. Every engineer, whether junior or senior, is involved in forums where they're working with product management roles, analyst roles, working with other engineers and other teams. So collaboration is really a big part of what we do. We pair program often.
Nice.
We collaborate widely, but also um, we're being challenged to collaborate asynchronously quite a lot as a
Good.
remote team.
Nice.
We're having to think about how do we move from just jump on a call to how can we present information so that people can process it without synchronous comms.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah, exactly.
communication is another big part of how we make things successful. We just ensure that we communicate clearly, concisely, give context, and structure our comms, use multiple channels. It's those sorts of principles that I think sets us up for success.
Yeah, that's critical.
Yeah.
That's critical as well. The multiple channels, I think, is really key.
Yeah.
You've done really well at unpicking some of the challenges, or if not all of the challenges that you face now or you're about to face in and around, platform and data teams. It'd be good to understand LandTech as a collective, what you're hiring for at the moment, because as always with us at Enginears, people listen. People want to get involved. It is a community. They do want to go and apply to some of these organizations that talk about some of what they're building. That's part and parcel of what we do. So help us understand a little bit more about what the teams are hiring for on a wider scale. We don't need to go into necessarily like deep granular detail, but just high level, what the teams might be looking for at this moment in time at LandTech.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're hiring for lots of different kinds of roles, whether it's engineering, product. So and I think coming up we'll definitely be hiring around more data roles,
Nice.
analysts and data experts, and data product managers as well. So I think we tend to hire very broadly. I think we have ebbs and flows in the roles that we hire for sure.
Yeah.
And so there are times where we're hiring for pretty much every role in one go, and then there are times where there are more kind of gaps that we need to fill, and so that does change. And I've noticed since I've been at LandTech, the hiring rate has ebbed and flowed quite often. We're not
Yeah.
talking a couple of years we have lots of hiring, and a couple of years we don't. Usually it's kind of a few weeks or months off, and then kind of back into hiring.
Yeah.
So I think anyone who is looking, I encourage them to look at the roles that we have currently, but also just reach out, because things like geospatial background,
Yeah.
knowledge of doing things that I've described, like abstractions in data platforms, they're going to be things that are going to really stand out as like experience that's going to help us drive us forward. So I always encourage people who are interested in that, have experience in that, to reach out anyway, regardless of the roles that we have advertised on our page.
I encourage it as well. I think you guys sound as if you're a real smart, real reflective bunch who are building something really quite cool. Really quite cool that pre our calls, I didn't imagine get involved, or everyone listening getting involved, and come and have a look at who LandTech are and some of the products that they're building. They're cool. They are really cool. VJ, for the last 45 minutes, you've really carefully unpicked what you guys and girls are doing, and shared some great insights and why you're doing things. I'm really looking forward to seeing where you guys and girls are in some months, even over a 12-month period. So I want to say a big thanks. And I want to say for everyone listening, like always, come and check these guys and girls out. Check VJ out and like, share, subscribe, and show the people around you what LandTech are doing. And a big round of applause and big thanks to you, VJ, for coming to talk to us.
Yeah, it's great. It's my pleasure.
Hey guys, thanks for watching this episode. Massively appreciate you listening and checking in with us. If you want to find out more about us and what we're doing, please check us out on social media. What we're trying to do at Enginears is build a community to drive knowledge sharing and experiences. On Twitter, we can be found at Enginears.io. It's no underscore. We've also got a website, which is Enginears.io. These links will all be posted in the description. Any feedback and comments are massively appreciated. We're always looking to improve on where we can. Thanks, guys.